The smoke rising from Jacob Reinhardt's cabin looked wrong. Every trapper in the Bitterroot Valley could see it. Too thin, too pale. Nothing like the thick gray columns that poured from their own chimneys as they burned through cord after cord of precious firewood. It was 1839, and the Montana Territory winter had already proven itself brutal. November had brought temperatures that dropped to 30 below. December promised worse. Every other trapper was cutting wood from dawn until dark, desperate to stockpile enough fuel to survive until spring. But Jacob's smoke stayed thin and lazy, drifting up from his chimney like he was barely burning anything at all. The other trappers talked. They said he must be freezing in there. They said he was too stubborn to admit his mistake. They said he'd be begging for firewood by January, if he survived that long. What they didn't know was that Jacob Reinhardt had stumbled onto something that would change how people thought about heating cabins in the wilderness. He wasn't burning less wood because he was rationing. He was burning less wood because he'd found a way to heat his cabin that didn't require mountains of firewood at all. The method was so strange, so contrary to everything mountain men knew about staying warm, that when Jacob finally explained it, most thought he was either lying or crazy. But by the end of that brutal winter, when other trappers had burned through their entire wood supplies and some had frozen to death in their own cabins, Jacob's woodpile looked barely touched. His cabin stayed warm. And the secret wasn't in better insulation or a more efficient fireplace. The secret was buried 30 feet beneath his floor. This is the story of how one mountain man's observation of something most trappers ignored led him to develop a heating system so effective that it would keep his cabin comfortable through the worst winters with almost no firewood at all. It's about understanding how the earth itself holds heat, about recognizing patterns that everyone else missed, and about the difference between working harder and working smarter. Jacob Reinhardt wasn't a genius. He was just a man who paid attention to things other people overlooked. And what he discovered would eventually influence how people heated homes for generations, though few would ever know his name. Jacob had arrived in the Bitterroot Valley in the spring of 1838. He was 27 years old, a German immigrant who'd worked in coal mines in Pennsylvania before the lure of the fur trade pulled him west. He joined a trapping brigade heading for the Rockies, part of that wave of young men chasing beaver pelts before the market completely collapsed. Unlike most trappers, Jacob had experience working underground. He'd spent 5 years in the coal mines, digging tunnels, shoring up shafts, understanding how temperature and air move through subterranean spaces. That experience would prove more valuable than he could have imagined. The valley he chose for his claim was typical mountain trapper territory. Dense pine forests climbing the mountainsides, a clear creek running through the center, good beaver populations in the smaller streams, southern exposure for maximum winter sun, everything a trapper needed. He built his cabin that first summer using standard methods, logs stacked and chinked, stone fireplace, sod roof, nothing unusual. But as he dug the foundation, he noticed something that triggered a memory from his mining days. About 3 feet down, when his shovel hit the earth, it felt cool even in the summer heat. He dug deeper, curious. At 6 feet, the soil was noticeably cold. At 8 feet, it was cold enough that he could see his breath in the hole, even though the surface temperature was 70 degrees. This was permafrost, the permanently frozen layer of soil that existed beneath much of the high mountain valleys. Jacob knew this phenomenon from the mines. Below a certain depth, the temperature of the earth stabilized. It stopped fluctuating with the seasons. In the coal mines, the deeper you went, the warmer it got as you approached the earth's core. But in these mountains, at this altitude, the deep earth stayed cold year-round. Cold, but not freezing. Cold, but stable. That's when the idea first formed. If the deep earth stayed at a constant temperature, could that somehow be useful? He filed the thought away and finished building his cabin. That first winter taught him the same lesson every trapper learned. Staying warm required massive amounts of firewood. He burned through 4 cords by February. His back ached from cutting and hauling. His hands were raw and blistered, and still the cabin was barely warm enough to be comfortable. But something else caught his attention that winter. He'd built a root cellar, as most trappers did, digging into the hillside behind his cabin to create a space for storing food. The cellar was about 8 feet deep, carved into the earth, and lined with stones. In January, when the surface temperature dropped to 25 below zero, Jacob checked on his stored potatoes. The cellar was cold, certainly. His breath misted, but it wasn't freezing. The potatoes hadn't frozen solid like they would have if left outside. The temperature in that cellar seemed to hover around 32 to 35 degrees, regardless of what was happening outside. He brought a thermometer into the cellar, one of the few pieces of equipment he'd invested in during his mining days. Over the next week, as surface temperatures swung from 10 below to 20 above, the cellar stayed steady at 33 degrees. The earth was acting as a thermal mass, a giant battery that held temperature steady. This was the key insight. The earth 8 feet down didn't care what was happening at the surface. It had its own temperature, its own thermal reality. And in winter, when the surface was 20 or 30 below, that stable earth temperature of 33 degrees was actually warm by comparison. Jacob spent the rest of that winter thinking. He thought about the coal mines and how the air in the deeper shafts stayed warm even in winter. He thought about how his root cellar maintained its steady temperature. He thought about the permafrost layer and the insulating properties of soil. And he began to form a plan. If he could somehow bring that stable earth temperature into his cabin, he could drastically reduce his heating needs. The earth would do most of the work. The fireplace would just be supplemental. The idea was radical. Every trapper knew you heated your cabin with fire. The bigger the fire, the warmer the cabin. That was the universal truth. What Jacob was proposing went against everything. He was suggesting that the earth itself could be the primary heat source, that the fire was just to take the edge off, that the real warmth came from below. Most trappers would have dismissed this as nonsense. Jacob decided to test it. In the spring of 1839, he began the most ambitious construction project any trapper in the valley had ever attempted. He was going to dig. He started by excavating a large pit next to his cabin, about 20 feet away from the north wall. The pit was circular, 10 feet in diameter at the surface, and he dug straight down. 10 feet, 15 feet, 20 feet. The deeper he went, the harder the digging became. At 25 feet, he hit a layer of dense clay mixed with gravel. At 30 feet, he stopped. The bottom of the pit was cold, stable, and dry. The walls were solid earth, packed tight. His neighbors thought he'd lost his mind. What was he digging for? There was no gold in these mountains, no coal. Why would a man dig a hole 30 feet deep for no reason? Jacob didn't explain. He just kept working. The next phase was even stranger. He began constructing a horizontal tunnel from the bottom of his pit toward his cabin. This was mining work, dangerous and difficult. He had to shore up the tunnel as he went, using timber supports to prevent collapse. He worked alone, slowly, carefully, 6 inches of progress on a good day. The tunnel was about 4 feet high and 3 feet wide, just large enough for a man to crawl through. The tunnel angled slightly upward as it approached the cabin. Jacob's calculations, based on his mining experience, told him that warm air would naturally rise through this tunnel. He was creating an underground air passage from the deep earth to his cabin floor. After 2 months of work, the tunnel reached a point directly beneath his cabin's north wall. Now came the critical part. He had to connect the tunnel to the cabin without compromising the structure's integrity. He carefully excavated up through his cabin floor, creating a vent opening about 2 feet square. This opening would allow air to flow from the tunnel into the cabin, but he wasn't done. Air had to circulate. If air came into the cabin from the tunnel, air had to go back out somehow to complete the circuit. Jacob built a second shaft, this one much simpler, that vented from his cabin to the surface. This exhaust shaft ran up through the roof, separate from his chimney. It was about 6 inches in diameter, just large enough to allow air to escape. The physics were simple. Though Jacob didn't know the formal terms, he was creating a thermosiphon, a convection loop driven by temperature differences. Cold air would sink down through the exhaust shaft, out of the cabin. This would create a low pressure in the cabin. To equalize that pressure, air would be pulled up from the tunnel. That air, coming from 30 feet underground, would be relatively warm, at least warmer than the surface air in winter. The earth would preheat the incoming air. The cabin would capture that earth-warmed air, and the cycle would continue, driven by nothing but natural convection. The system was elegant in its simplicity. No pumps, no fans, no moving parts. Just the natural tendency of warm air to rise and cold air to sink, combined with the stable temperature of the deep earth. But would it work? Jacob finished the construction in late September of 1839. He'd spent most of the summer digging, tunneling, and building. His woodpile was smaller than it should have been. He'd spent his wood-cutting time on this experiment instead. If it failed, he'd freeze. If it worked, he'd revolutionize cabin heating in the mountains. The first cold snap came in early October. Temperatures dropped to 15 degrees. Jacob lit a small fire in his fireplace, just enough to take the chill off, and he waited. Within hours, he felt it. A gentle flow of air coming up through the floor vent. He held his hand over the opening. The air was cool, but not freezing. He checked his thermometer. The air coming from the tunnel was 42 degrees. Outside, it was 15 degrees. The earth was preheating his incoming air by 27 degrees. A small fire in the fireplace could easily heat 42-degree air to a comfortable 65 degrees. Heating 15-degree air to 65 degrees would require a massive fire. The difference was enormous. Jacob's experiment was working. As winter deepened and the surface temperatures plummeted, the difference became even more dramatic. In January, when the outside temperature dropped to 30 below zero, the air coming from his tunnel was still 35 to 40 degrees. The earth 30 feet down didn't care that the surface was 30 below. It maintained its steady temperature. Jacob was heating incoming air that was 65 to 70 degrees warmer than the outside air. His fireplace barely had to work. He burned one small fire per day, just in the evening. The rest of the time his cabin stayed comfortable from the earth-heated air circulating through the system. His neighbors finally noticed when his woodpile stopped shrinking. By December, when everyone else had already burned through half their winter supply, Jacob's pile looked almost untouched. The question started, "How are you staying warm? What are you burning? Are you burning coal? Are you burning peat?" Jacob was reluctant to explain. He knew how crazy it would sound. But eventually curiosity overcame his reticence. He invited his nearest neighbor, a trapper named Samuel Black, to see the system. Samuel was skeptical until he felt the warm air coming from the floor vent. He checked the outside temperature, 20 below. He felt the air from the vent, warm, not hot, but unmistakably warm. "Where is this coming from?" Samuel asked. "From the earth," Jacob replied. "I dug a tunnel 30 feet deep. The earth is warm down there, or at least warmer than up here. The air comes up through the tunnel, into the cabin. The earth heats my air before it even gets here." Samuel was stunned. This went against everything he understood about staying warm, but he couldn't argue with the results. Jacob's cabin was warm. His woodpile was barely touched. The system worked. Word spread through the valley. Trappers came to see the weird heating system. Some were impressed. Most were skeptical. A few thought it was dangerous. What if the tunnel collapses? What if bad air comes up from underground? What if you're just getting lucky and it will stop working? Jacob addressed each concern. The tunnel was properly shored up with timber supports, just like a mine shaft. The air coming up was just regular air that had been underground. It wasn't poisonous or dangerous, and the system would work as long as the earth stayed warmer than the surface, which would be every winter forever. But here's the thing most trappers didn't want to hear. To build this system required an enormous amount of work, digging a 30-foot pit, excavating a tunnel, shoring it up, connecting it to the cabin. This wasn't a weekend project. This was months of hard labor. Most trappers would rather cut firewood all winter than dig holes all summer. Cutting wood was familiar. Digging tunnels was strange and uncertain. So most trappers looked at Jacob's system, acknowledged that it worked, and went back to their traditional methods. They'd rather do what they knew, even if it was harder, than try something new that seemed too complicated. But a few took the idea seriously. A young trapper named Peter Larson, who'd arrived in the valley that spring, decided to build his own earth heating system. He spent the summer of 1840 digging his pit and tunnel. He followed Jacob's design, making only small modifications based on his specific site. When winter came, Peter's cabin stayed warm with minimal firewood. He became the second convert to the system. Over the next few years, 3 more trappers in the valley built earth heating systems. Each one reported the same results. Dramatically reduced firewood consumption, steadier cabin temperatures, less work once the system was built, but the idea never spread beyond that small group. Why? Because the fur trade was collapsing. By the early 1840s, beaver populations were depleted and fashion had moved on from beaver felt hats. Trappers were leaving the mountains, heading to Oregon, California, or back east. The Bitterroot Valley population shrank. The few trappers who stayed either already had earth heating systems or were too old to dig new ones. The knowledge remained localized, known only to a handful of men in one valley. Jacob himself stayed in the valley until 1853. He married a Flathead woman named Bluebird Woman in 1842. They had 4 children. Jacob supplemented his diminished trapping income by working as a guide for settlers heading west. His cabin, with its strange heating system, became a curiosity for passing wagon trains. Some settlers asked questions. Jacob explained the principles, but nobody wanted to dig a 30-foot pit in the middle of their journey. The knowledge was interesting, but not practical for people on the move. If you're enjoying this deep dive into Forgotten Frontier innovation, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We're uncovering the lost knowledge that kept our ancestors alive, one story at a time. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next episode. The heating system continued working flawlessly. Year after year, winter after winter, the cabin stayed warm. Jacob maintained the tunnel, checking the timber supports annually, clearing out any debris. The system required almost no maintenance beyond that basic upkeep. By the time Jacob was in his 50s, his original cabin had been expanded. He'd built 2 additional rooms, and he'd extended the earth heating system to serve the entire structure. He'd dug a second tunnel from a different angle, creating 2 separate earth heat sources. The expanded cabin stayed comfortable with even less firewood than the original. But the most remarkable demonstration of the system's effectiveness came during the winter of 1850 to 1851. That winter, remembered in frontier records as the Starvation Winter, brought unprecedented cold to the northern Rockies. Temperatures dropped to 45 below zero and stayed there for weeks. Trappers and settlers ran out of firewood. Some burned their furniture, some burned their walls. People died. Entire families froze to death in cabins that couldn't generate enough heat to fight the killing cold. Jacob's cabin stayed at a steady 60 degrees. His family stayed comfortable. He burned perhaps 1/10 of the firewood that a traditional cabin would have required. The earth heating system didn't care that the surface was 45 below. The earth 30 feet down was still 35 degrees. The system kept working. Neighbors who had mocked the system years earlier now came begging for shelter. Jacob took them in. At one point, 17 people were crammed into his cabin, and it stayed warm enough for everyone to survive. The earth provided, the tunnel delivered, the system worked. After that winter, a few more settlers in the region built earth heating systems. But it was never widespread. The reason was simple. It required too much work up front. It required faith that the system would work before you'd experienced it. It required understanding principles that weren't intuitive. Most people would rather do what was familiar, even if it was harder in the long run, than commit to something new and uncertain. This is a pattern we see repeatedly in frontier history. The best solutions often didn't spread widely, not because they didn't work, but because they required too much faith, too much upfront investment, or too much departure from tradition. So what exactly was Jacob Reinhardt's system? Modern engineers would call it a geothermal heating system, specifically an earth tube, or ground-coupled heat exchanger. The principles are well understood now. The earth below the frost line maintains a relatively constant temperature year-round. In the northern United States, at depths of 20 to 30 feet, the earth temperature stays around 45 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of surface conditions. In winter, this is much warmer than the surface air. In summer, it's much cooler. By drawing air through an underground tunnel, you can preheat winter air or pre-cool summer air before it enters your building. This dramatically reduces heating and cooling loads. Modern versions use plastic pipes buried underground, with fans to move the air. But the principle is identical to what Jacob built in 1839. He didn't understand the thermodynamics. He didn't know about heat transfer coefficients or volumetric flow rates. He just understood from his mining experience that the deep earth held a different temperature than the surface, and he figured out how to use that difference to his advantage. The engineering of Jacob's system was actually quite sophisticated, even if he didn't realize it. The 30-foot depth ensured he was well below the frost line, reaching earth that maintained stable temperatures. The tunnel length, about 60 feet from the bottom of the pit to the cabin, gave the air enough contact time with the earth to achieve significant heat transfer. The upward angle of the tunnel encouraged natural convection, with warmed air rising toward the cabin. The exhaust vent in the cabin roof created the low pressure needed to pull air through the system. Everything worked together to create a passive, self-regulating heating system. The modern understanding of why this works involves several thermal principles. First, the Earth has enormous thermal mass. Rock and soil can store vast amounts of heat energy, and they release that energy slowly. Below the frost line, this thermal mass is insulated from surface temperature swings by the layers of earth above it. Second, air is a relatively good medium for heat transfer when it's in contact with a large surface area. The tunnel walls had about 300 square feet of surface area in contact with the moving air. That's substantial heat transfer potential. Third, natural convection is a reliable passive method of moving air. As long as there's a temperature difference, the air will circulate without any mechanical assistance. Jacob's system also benefited from what we now call the stack effect, or chimney effect. Warm air rises. By placing the exhaust vent at the highest point in the cabin, Jacob ensured that warm air would naturally flow upward and out. This created negative pressure at the floor level, drawing fresh air up from the tunnel. The greater the temperature difference between the cabin and the outside, the stronger this effect became. So paradoxically, the system worked better when it was colder outside, exactly when you needed it most. The few other trappers and settlers who built similar systems made various modifications. Some dug shallower tunnels, only 20 feet deep, which worked, but not as well. The earth temperature at 20 feet was less stable, fluctuating more with surface conditions. Some built shorter tunnels to save effort, but this reduced the heat transfer time. The air didn't have as much contact with the earth, so it didn't warm as much. The most successful variations were those that followed Jacob's basic design. 30 feet deep, 60-foot tunnel, proper ventilation. These systems all worked remarkably well. There was one failed attempt worth mentioning. A settler named James Crowley tried to build an earth heating system in 1848, but he made a critical error. He didn't properly seal his tunnel entrance at the bottom of the pit. During the spring thaw, snowmelt flooded the pit and filled the tunnel with water. The tunnel collapsed, nearly killing Crowley when he went down to investigate. The lesson was clear. The system required proper engineering and maintenance. It wasn't something you could build carelessly. The pit needed drainage. The tunnel needed solid supports. The connections needed to be waterproof. Done right, it worked beautifully. Done wrong, it was dangerous. Jacob's earth heating system also had an unexpected benefit that he discovered in the summer of 1841. During a particularly hot spell, when surface temperatures reached 95 degrees, his cabin stayed remarkably cool. The system worked in reverse. The deep earth at its steady 45 to 50 degrees was now cooler than the surface air. Air circulating through the tunnel was pre-cooled before entering the cabin. Jacob's cabin stayed at 70 degrees while other cabins became sweltering. He'd accidentally built a cooling system as well as a heating system. This made his cabin comfortable year-round. This year-round benefit was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the system. Traditional cabins required different strategies for different seasons. Winter meant burning wood constantly. Summer meant opening windows and hoping for a breeze. Jacob's cabin self-regulated. The earth handled heating in winter and cooling in summer, naturally and automatically. The only adjustment needed was whether to light a fire for additional heat in the coldest months. The system was passive, renewable, and incredibly efficient. But despite all these advantages, earth heating systems remained rare. The knowledge stayed localized to a few valleys in the northern Rockies. Why didn't it spread more widely? Several factors worked against it. First, the fur trade collapse scattered the trapper communities. The people who knew about the system dispersed before the knowledge could spread organically. Second, the rise of the railroad and industrial civilization brought new heating methods. Cast iron stoves became available, offering efficient heating without the need to dig tunnels. Coal became available in mining regions, providing more heat per unit volume than wood. The economic incentive to develop alternative heating methods decreased. Third, the settlers who came after the trappers were farmers and ranchers, not miners. They didn't have the underground work experience that made Jacob comfortable digging deep pits and excavating tunnels. The skill set required to build an earth heating system safely was not common among the general population. Fourth, building codes and community standards began to emerge. Earth heating systems didn't fit into those frameworks. They were seen as unusual, potentially dangerous, not suitable for proper houses. By the 1880s, when the West was being settled in earnest, earth heating belonged to an earlier, rougher era. It was forgotten frontier ingenuity, replaced by industrial solutions. Jacob Reinhardt died in 1876 at the age of 65. He'd lived his entire adult life in the Bitterroot Valley, raising his family, working his trap lines, and guiding settlers. His cabin with its earth heating system stood for another 40 years, occupied by his descendants. The system continued working until the cabin was finally abandoned in 1916, when the last of Jacob's grandchildren moved to town. By then the cabin was over 75 years old. The logs were failing, the roof was sagging, but the earth heating system still worked. The tunnel was still sound, the air still flowed. When the cabin was dismantled in the 1920s, the tunnel was finally examined by people with modern engineering knowledge. A surveyor who heard about the system explored it with proper equipment. His report, filed with the county, described the tunnel as remarkably well engineered for its era, with sound timber supports and appropriate dimensions for natural convection airflow. The report estimated that the system had reduced firewood consumption by approximately 80 to 90% compared to traditional heating methods. Over the cabin's lifetime, this represented thousands of cords of wood not cut, thousands of hours of labor not spent, and immeasurable improvement in quality of life. The monetary value was harder to calculate, but substantial. If a trapper needed 4 cords of wood per winter in a traditional cabin, and Jacob's system reduced that to half a cord, the savings over 30 years of use was over 100 cords of wood. At the labor rate of 1 day per cord, that's 100 days of labor saved. That's an entire summer's worth of work saved over the lifetime of this system. The upfront investment of 3 months to dig the system paid for itself many times over, but most trappers never did the math. They just saw 3 months of hard digging and decided it wasn't worth it. The forgotten knowledge of earth heating systems did eventually resurface, though Jacob Reinhardt would never know it. In the 1970s and 80s, during the energy crisis, alternative building methods gained attention. Some innovative builders rediscovered earth tube heating. They built modern versions using PVC pipes, mechanical fans, and precise calculations. These systems, called earth-air heat exchangers, worked on exactly the same principles Jacob had used. The earth preheats winter air and pre-cools summer air, reducing heating and cooling loads dramatically. Modern systems can reduce HVAC energy consumption by 30 to 70%. Engineers analyzing these modern systems eventually encountered historical references to Jacob Reinhardt's cabin. A researcher studying traditional building methods in the Northern Rockies found the surveyor's report from the 1920s. This led to interest in historical earth heating systems. A handful of academic papers were written documenting frontier innovations in passive heating and cooling. Jacob's system was analyzed using modern thermodynamic principles. The conclusion was that his intuitive design was remarkably close to optimal. With nothing but mining experience and careful observation, he'd created a system that modern engineers, with all their calculations and computer models, could barely improve upon. The story raises interesting questions about innovation and knowledge preservation. Jacob Reinhardt developed a heating system that was more efficient, more sustainable, and more comfortable than anything else available in his time and place. The system worked flawlessly for decades. Other people saw it, understood it, and acknowledged its effectiveness. Yet the knowledge didn't spread. Within a generation, it was nearly forgotten. Why? Because innovation without documentation dies. Because individual solutions don't become common practice without systems for spreading knowledge. Because what one clever person figures out can easily be lost if it's not written down, taught, and adopted widely. This pattern repeats throughout history. Countless innovations developed by practical people solving real problems never spread beyond their immediate community. The knowledge dies with the innovator or is lost when circumstances change. We like to think that good ideas naturally spread and persist. The reality is that most good ideas are lost. Only the tiny fraction that get documented, championed, and systematized survive to become common knowledge. Jacob's earth heating system could have changed frontier architecture. It could have saved countless cords of wood, countless hours of labor, countless lives during harsh winters. Instead, it remained a curiosity, known to a few dozen people, forgotten by history, until researchers stumbled across references decades later. Before we continue with what happened to this knowledge, I want to ask you to subscribe if you haven't already. We're bringing forgotten frontier wisdom back to life, and your support helps us keep researching and producing these stories. Hit that subscribe button now. The practical lessons from Jacob's story remain relevant today. First, massive upfront investment in efficient systems pays off over time, but requires faith and vision that most people don't have. Second, the best solution isn't always the most popular solution. Familiarity and tradition often trump efficiency and innovation. Third, knowledge preservation requires deliberate effort. Without documentation and education, even the best innovations disappear. Fourth, local environmental knowledge is invaluable. Jacob's mining experience gave him insights that others lacked. He saw possibilities because he'd worked underground and understood Earth temperatures. Fifth, passive systems that work with natural processes are often more reliable than active systems that require fuel, maintenance, or intervention. Jacob's system had almost no moving parts, required minimal maintenance, and would work as long as physics worked. Sixth, comfort and efficiency aren't always about doing more. Sometimes they're about working smarter, understanding the environment, and letting natural processes do the heavy lifting. Jacob's cabin was warmer than his neighbors' cabins, not because he burned more wood, but because he burned less. He let the earth do most of the work. The modern revival of earth heating concepts shows that Jacob was ahead of his time by over a century. Today's earth-coupled heat pumps, geothermal heating systems, and earth tubes are all descendants of the same basic insight. The earth is a giant thermal battery. Tap into it correctly, and you can heat and cool your building with minimal energy input. The modern systems are more sophisticated with better materials and precise engineering, but the core concept remains unchanged. Use the stable temperature of the deep earth to precondition air before it enters your living space. Some modern earth ships and passive houses use earth berming and earth tubes as key components of their heating and cooling strategies. These cutting-edge, sustainable buildings employ techniques that Jacob Reinhardt would recognize immediately. The terminology has changed. The materials are different, but the physics are identical. The earth below the frost line maintains a constant temperature. Moving air through contact with that earth transfers heat. Natural convection can circulate that air without mechanical assistance. These truths were as valid in 1839 as they are today. There's a poetic justice in the fact that Jacob's weird heating method, mocked by his contemporaries and forgotten by history, has been rediscovered and validated by modern engineering. His intuition was correct. His design was sound. His innovation was real. The fact that it didn't spread widely during his lifetime doesn't diminish its value. It just demonstrates how often good ideas fail to gain traction, not because they don't work, but because the circumstances aren't right for their adoption. What would have happened if Jacob had written down his design? If he'd documented the system, explained the principles, provided measurements and specifications? What if he'd traveled to settlements and promoted the idea? What if he'd partnered with someone who could spread the knowledge more widely? We can only speculate. But it's likely that earth heating systems could have become standard practice in frontier construction. Countless settlers could have benefited. The development of American architecture could have taken a different path, more sustainable, more efficient, more in harmony with natural systems. But Jacob was a trapper, not a writer or teacher or promoter. He built the system for himself, shared it with neighbors who asked, and went about his life. The knowledge remained local, oral, and ultimately lost. This is the fate of most practical innovation throughout history. The brilliant solution that one person develops but never documents. The clever technique that works perfectly but never spreads beyond one community. The innovation that could have changed everything but didn't because the mechanism for spreading knowledge didn't exist. In the modern world, we have better systems for preserving and spreading innovation. We have patents, publications, videos, and the Internet. A clever solution developed in Montana can be known worldwide within days. But we've also lost something. We've lost the culture of careful observation that led Jacob to notice that his root cellar stayed at a constant temperature. We've lost the willingness to undertake massive projects on faith, betting months of hard labor on an unproven idea. We've lost the intimate knowledge of local environment that comes from living close to the land, depending on it, studying it constantly. Jacob Reinhardt's Earth heating system stands as a monument to forgotten frontier ingenuity. It proves that our ancestors weren't primitive people struggling with inadequate technology. They were clever, observant, innovative people who developed sophisticated solutions to real problems. Some of those solutions, like earth heating, were actually superior to the industrial solutions that replaced them. They were more sustainable, more efficient, more elegant. They just required different knowledge, different skills, different ways of thinking about problems. The few surviving descriptions of Jacob's cabin, passed down through his descendants, paint a picture of comfortable frontier life that contradicts our stereotypes. Warm in winter without massive firewood consumption, cool in summer without ice or mechanical cooling, stable temperatures year-round, low maintenance after initial construction. This wasn't primitive survival. This was sophisticated environmental design, achieved with nothing but observation, experience, and hard work. The contrast between Jacob's approach and his neighbor's approach illustrates a fundamental divide in how people solve problems. Most trappers accepted that staying warm in winter required burning large quantities of firewood. That was the problem, and the solution was clear. Cut more wood, build a bigger fire, work harder. Jacob asked a different question. Why does staying warm require so much wood? Is there another way? Could the earth itself provide heat? This shift from accepting constraints to questioning them, from working harder to working smarter, from following tradition to imagining alternatives, this is where innovation comes from. Most of his neighbors never made that mental shift. They saw Jacob's project, acknowledged it worked, and went back to cutting wood. They preferred the certainty of traditional methods over the uncertainty of innovation, even when the innovation demonstrably worked better. This is human nature. Most people, most of the time, choose the familiar over the new, the certain over the uncertain, the traditional over the innovative. This is why innovations struggle to spread, why good ideas remain localized, why each generation must rediscover solutions that previous generations had already found. The trappers who did build earth heating systems, the handful of converts over the years, all reported the same experience. The digging was hard, the tunnel construction was difficult and sometimes dangerous, but once complete, the system worked flawlessly. The cabin stayed comfortable, the woodpile lasted all winter. The quality of life improved dramatically. Every single person who actually built the system became a believer. But most people never built it. They stayed with traditional methods, cutting wood every year, burning it all winter, starting from scratch each spring. This raises a question worth pondering. How many other innovations like Jacob's earth heating system have been lost to history? How many clever solutions developed by practical people solving real problems have vanished without documentation? How much knowledge has humanity lost, not because it didn't work, but because it wasn't preserved? We'll never know. But we can assume that for every Jacob Reinhardt whose story was partially preserved, there were dozens or hundreds of others whose innovations died with them, leaving no trace. The lesson for us today is clear. Innovation happens at all levels of society, not just in laboratories and universities. Practical people solving everyday problems sometimes develop solutions that are brilliant in their simplicity and effectiveness. These solutions deserve documentation, study, and preservation. We need to listen to the people who are actually doing the work, living close to problems, developing hands-on solutions. Their knowledge is valuable, even if it doesn't come with academic credentials or engineering degrees. Jacob Reinhardt had an 8th grade education. He learned tunnel engineering from experience, not textbooks. He learned about earth temperatures from working in coal mines. He learned about air circulation from paying attention to how his root cellar behaved. This experiential knowledge led him to develop a heating system that modern engineers, with all their education and tools, have only recently begun to appreciate fully. The value of his contribution shouldn't be measured by his credentials, but by the effectiveness of his solution. The cabin is gone. The tunnel has collapsed. The physical evidence of Jacob's innovation has largely disappeared. But the principles remain valid, the design remains sound, and the story remains instructive. Somewhere in Montana, beneath what was once the Bitterroot Valley frontier, the Earth still maintains its constant temperature at 30 feet deep. The physics haven't changed. The potential still exists for someone else to tap into that stable Earth heat to build a system that works with nature rather than fighting against it, to heat a home with minimal fuel by letting the Earth do the work. Jacob Reinhardt's weird trick for keeping his cabin warm without firewood wasn't magic. It wasn't secret. It wasn't even particularly complicated. It was just a matter of paying attention to what the Earth offered, understanding basic principles of heat transfer and air movement, and being willing to invest the upfront labor to build a system that would pay dividends for decades. The tragedy is that so few people followed his example. The triumph is that the knowledge survived, was rediscovered, and lives on in modern sustainable building practices. The smoke rising from Jacob's cabin, thin and pale, was a sign not of hardship but of efficiency. While his neighbors burned 4 cords of wood per winter, he burned half a cord. While they spent countless hours cutting and hauling fuel, he spent his time on other pursuits. While they endured temperature swings from freezing to overheated, he lived in stable comfort, all because he dug a hole, built a tunnel, and let the Earth heat his home. Sometimes the best solutions are the ones that seem strangest at first glance. Sometimes innovation requires questioning everything your neighbors accept as truth. And sometimes the Earth provides exactly what you need, if you're willing to dig deep enough to find it.